Hi, Antonio. It's really great to be sitting here with you today. I know you've done a lot of work and advisory in terms of AI, so I want to get straight into the point. What's your view about the public perception and some of the biggest issues in that sector?
Well, thank you, and it's great to be with you, Shuying. One of the biggest changes, so we at the PSC have had the privilege of working in earnest in AI since around 2018. So from the kind of the narrow, very defined machine learning techniques back then to obviously the more, I hesitate to say more exciting, but the generative AI, AGI world, which has really captured the imagination in the last few years. And over that period, we've seen a journey from relative ambivalence through to excitement, through to active dislike, and we are in a position now in the mid to late 2020s, whereby that dislike is manifesting itself in different ways. So there are demographic differences, and we would see, crudely younger demographics as slightly more hostile and concerned about AI use, but on the whole, most people are pessimistic as to the potential benefits from AI and not particularly pro its use. And that really has changed in just a few years, and that is not exclusively a UK thing. We've seen that in the US as well, but it's also not a globally uniform point either. There are some countries, Brazil, India in particular, which have really quite high levels of both engagement and trust and excitement around AI. And so we're seeing a real splintering of views and opinions, but it is tending towards the less positive at the moment.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think you talked about other countries, and we know in the UK there are a lot of actions and strategies and plans about AI, and regional and national governments, they're all making loads of new policies about AI. So I think given the context you just said, do you think there's a need or a reason that the government would want to engage with the public a bit more in the AI space?
I think there's a really, really strong case for it. So, we are living through and this is now a commonplace view, but when we first wrote it in AI Demystified, it was a pioneering view. We're really living through a revolutionary general purpose technology, its emergence and all of the consequences that has on a society. And we look at previous general purpose technology through history. That could be the spoken word, it could be the advent of electricity, the steam engine, much more recently the open internet, and indeed smartphones, for which we're still feeling the repercussions right now. And the key point about them is they change everything, and they change things in very, very uncertain ways. And there is absolutely no good implicit reason why they will change things for the better without the direction of forces in to ensure that. And so engaging with one of the great strengths of any country, but of course we're in Britain, so of the UK in particular, which is its people, in that conversation, in that deliberation, in that discussion around how a new technology such as AI should be used, is a brilliant idea. It's a fantastic way to try and gain a sense of agency, so that people feel that they are using and driving how and where this technology is and isn't used. A sense of legitimacy because you've engaged citizen agreement in where and how technology is used. And more importantly, no government, no policymaker has all the answers. And everything we know about innovation is that it's the people doing the doing at the front line who often know where the greatest gains can be had. So public engagement has a means of addressing all of those points.
Amazing. So if I can actually insert a little bit of terminology here, I think just to also remind our listeners, citizen engagement, which is broadly just talking about involving citizens in the public to shape or in some cases make decisions about policies and about really emerging issues like AI or anything else, has been demonstrated time and time again to strengthen the policymaking. And I think one of the reasons that it can strengthen the policymaking is because it really gives whoever is making the decision a fuller understanding of the public, where their worries are and where they think this could go and how it shapes the services and their lives in the real world. And another thing that you talked about, especially with deliberative events or wider public engagement, it's the views, the diverse views that you can hear. And I think the PSC has been involved in a lot of the projects where we do lived experience research or public engagement. We hear things that we haven't heard before. And, if we just sit in a small boardroom, this is not something that we can think of. And I think this is really, really important for something like AI, which is changing the fabric of the society and really is impacting how everyone's everyday is going to look like in the future. So I think there's actually a risk of regional or national governments not thinking anything about having that conversation with the public. And I think that should be the way we design the future policies in this country.
Yeah, and you've beautifully set out those kind of the broad spectrum of ways of engaging people and different techniques within that. And those are the absolute macro ones. I wonder, genuine question, I often wonder if there's a micro level of engagement, which is user research. So when we help clients build digital services, a big part of that is engaging with people to understand what are their true user needs, their true problems, challenges, opportunities. Once we understand that a bit better, show a different bunch of prototypes for potential services and tools, and then once the service is working, actually continuously engage with individuals to try and optimize and refine. Where would you put user research on that kind of spectrum of engagement?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the first time there was like a systematic layout of the engagement with the public is probably back in the 1960s and 70s when in the US, Sherry Einstein has raised this concept of a ladder of citizen participation. It was later adapted in the UK to be called a ladder of co-production. And so it's from informing to engaging to kind of co-design, and the ultimate form obviously is co-production when things are being decided by a group rather than just in the boardroom. So I would say with user research, understand how service users will actually interact with the service or a new technology. They'll probably be more in that co-design / consultation piece, which I think is already something really, really good if if some government bodies are already doing that. But I think just generally pushing upwards in the ladder, I know it's difficult to do sometimes, but a mindset of having that conversation is really important.
And what's been really exciting for a period in the UK recently about this approach to developing new services, institutions, approaches, big policy questions, is there seems to be a real embracement of these techniques. So we've seen the 10-year plan for the NHS actually had a huge amount of different techniques that you would say about engaging frontline staff in their views and thoughts. There are many consultations out at the moment, be it from social media to other elements. Into social care, there will be the Casey Commission. And I think on digital ID, there's also a commitment to a sort of a 120-person form of citizen panel to understand views, which is so important. And we've been involved in some of this work, haven't we?
Absolutely. One of the things we were so glad to be able to support the government on is the TIMSS review. We know this is kind of a groundbreaking co-production of a government review that hadn't been done in the same scale before. So I think the commitment that this is being seen from the government is really encouraging. And I think what I want to say is, co-production has its place, a national conversation has its place, particularly in defining something that it has a lot of uncertainty, as you said before, and to gather that broader view, because as you say, people are having that mistrust. People are now moving to general dislike of that new technology. And I think if the government goes on and define a new policy that hasn't got the public mandate, it's actually quite damaging in the long term. So I would encourage the government to think about these different public engagement methodologies, and we don't have to start always at the full scale of doing a co-production like we do with DWP on the TIMSS review. But a consultation, a co-design workshop, these are all good steps. And coming back to our expertise, in addition to the TIMSS review, we've also done a lot of research to inform policies for the Cabinet Office. We've done the pay discrimination piece to inform the Equality Act. We also are doing a piece on socioeconomic duty to inform the stat guidance. And I think there are a lot of other examples as well. Anything come to mind
Gosh,
that I
yes.
have missed? Yeah.
I mean, some work in the... Is this right? Is this the pre ChatGPT 3 November 2022 launch? We were doing work with UKRI, and then around about that same phase with Dare UK, who are a great organisation looking to bring under the auspices of the different research organisations ways of bringing together data sets to solve complex cross-domain, cross-jurisdictional big questions, the interrelation between socioeconomic well-being and retail cost of living and other questions. And those were big engaged workshops that brought together a cross-section of representatives from academia, from industry, from the public, to work out big challenges. So that was work for Dare UK, but also there was work in that we've done for BridgeAI, so an exciting organisation that's a part of UKRI, identifying massive opportunities for AI based on use cases. And again, that's bringing together differing points of view and expertise, but also just lived experience in the widest sense, in order to identify those opportunities. And what feels both exciting and novel and encouraging about that is, at the moment, there are big unanswered questions about AI. Of which the biggest is cui bono, right? Who benefits and by how from this potential huge economic dividend, which is still potential. If we can realize some of those productivity gains, how do citizens benefit from that? How is that distributed fairly? How do we ensure that the incentives are in the right place? No country in the world, nobody knows the answers to those questions yet. It's a great privilege to live through a period where there is such uncertainty, but it's also a great opportunity to make sure that we bring the wisdom of the British people to bear on that. So it feels like a really ripe time to have that national conversation on AI and make sure that's done on a regional basis as well, with all the nuances and sensitivities appreciated of how there are differences in employment patterns, in opportunities, in geographic needs across the country. But it feels like a great time to be doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with the kind of diversity of different regions and the nuances between the difference in these regions. I think one of the other things I want to raise is, like, often these public engagement, they are mixed methods. So you don't just kind of rely on one methodologies. You could do interviews, you could do workshops, but you could also do kind of more full-on democratic deliberation, or another way to do is public dialogue. So I think the beauty of that is then you bring together groups. I think you mentioned people in the British public. Some of them would bring expertise in, like, how AI works. I'm sure there are a lot of AI experts right now, and some of them will bring in how that has impacted their, work day to day. Are they worried about job loss, and therefore, how should we deal with that? Some of them care about the environment and the energy, and some of them will talk about data centers and infrastructure. So I think a rounded view and discussion on all of these topics will really help the government make, sounded and strong policies in that area.
And there's a sense that when we're working in these uncharted questions of domains where we don't quite know the answers, so it's helpful almost to separate out what do we already know, what do we think we know, and what do we know that we don't know. I mean, unfortunately, it's the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns again. But anyway, and if we work through a few examples of that, so a few things that we try and contribute to those big debates at the PSC. So one is, like, where do we know that value is already being generated by AI? So one of the things that we keep tabs on is we have our Gen AI use case library. So this is something we do across,
Yep.
collect from all of our work with clients, but also from all of our research across all the world, which is really to see, where are the most advanced deployments of not advanced in a technical basis, but advanced in terms of the maturity of the benefits being realized across public services. And that's something which we've published before. People can find on our website, but we'll be updating shortly. So kind of the AI use case track, and that's so helpful for kind of forming your strategy. Where should we use this? But there's a lot of evidence being gathered there. The second question is how do you deploy AI within an organization well? So that's something we work with clients on across a number of parts of the public sector now. And there we use the APO approach, the AI Portfolio Program Office. And of course, we do the doing to ourselves as well. And we use it at the PSC. And that's how do you create a lightweight structure to guide what is the direction of AI? Are you going to be a novel leader? Are you going to be a fast follower? Are you going to be a judicious kind of wait and see strategy? What's the strategy? What are the policies? What's the guidance? How do you manage the licenses? How do you manage the controls, the permission? And how do you identify the use cases, track and evaluate the benefits, and upskill people and give people the opportunity to voice concerns, work them through, and demonstrate how you're being responsible in AI's use. So that's the APO approach. Those are two areas, where's it being used and how do you deploy well within organizations that are more mature?
Yeah.
For these big questions about, what is the right skill mix for future employment needs in an AI world, unanswered questions, prime use for those mixed methods approaches that you were talking about and bringing the public into the conversation.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I know Apple is not something that is kind of just theoretical and something that we use internally. I know we have used it with our clients as well. Are you having anything to share on that front?
We should, in fact, you remind me, Shuying, we should invite our wonderful clients on to talk about this exactly for a future episode. But the one thing that is actually really hits home is that change, we talked about this with Ellie Bond on a previous episode, change is hard. Yeah. And the business of change is exhausting. It's as much a kind of an endurance and a motivation and an enthusiasm and bringing people together to help them see it's going to be worth it game as anything else. Yeah. And so when you're using the APO technique, it provides really helpful clarity, but it doesn't answer every question. It doesn't solve for every edge case of, is it fair use to use AI in the following means? There's a lot of grey that still remains. And so even though these techniques really help, there's a lot of human judgment that remains. And there's a lot of, I think, humility in appreciating that people who work in public services, do an incredible job, full stop, and they're under so much strain, but B, those working in the transformation of public services on top of BAU, it's hard. And so anything that we can do to make people's lives a bit easier in those areas is valuable.
Yeah. And in fact, if I link back to the public engagement point, and I think sometimes when decision makers or policy commissioners, they engage with the public actually do bring insights into how these things should be implemented as well. And that is something that I think people sometimes don't think about, but it is definitely an added value from the public engagement. And to make sure that anything that you do implement, it's in a time frame that is acceptable to people, it is in a way that people are going to like, and therefore ultimately I think it goes back to that legitimacy and public mandate point. And I think, there's definitely an argument to have that national conversation on AI. So what do you think public bodies are now interested in this should do next?
The first is you don't need to go big bang, and this doesn't need to be just for a singular department or regional office or combined authority to do. Anyone can do this if they have a clear sense of who their public users are and how they can ask them questions about public value. Yeah. The second is, as we've set out, there is a wide array of different techniques that you can use, and you can start small.
Yep.
You could do even small co-design workshops might be an opportunity, but also keep your eye on the bigger potential of those more larger scale approaches. But the big thing is to work out what are the exam questions that you want help on, and structure backwards how you can get to those. So certain questions where people might be thinking of would be, when it comes to being responsible in the use of AI, do we have red lines as to where and when it wouldn't be deployed? Do we have a sense of how we would define whether a risk threshold, where the risk threshold lies? You know, the EU AI Act is all about risk thresholds that will come into force this autumn. That's obviously an example from elsewhere, but, you know, do we have a sense within our local populations where those risk levels lie? What is the right level of skilling, reskilling, uptooling, support that's needed within certain areas? What are the gaps in access to new digital infrastructure, which could be compute, it could still be just basic internet connectivity, and do we have a good sense of that? And most importantly, I feel underneath all of this, what will it take for people to feel confident and excited and, for want of a better term, you know, have trust that this will be deployed to their benefit? Because all of the evidence so far would suggest, and there's some great research on this, that, you know, trust and adoption, and this government has, you know, wisely set an ambition to be a fast adopter of AI on the basis that input measure is a pretty good predictor of further output and outcome measures. Trust and adoption relate very strongly. So if people trust that this is going to help them, they're more likely to use it, and they're more likely to use it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about trust is, when we do public engagement, actually that feedback loop with the public is really important, because they're not going to just have one meeting with you and then automatically there's trust. I think the process has to be designed to have that, you know, regular touch point with the public, and therefore they understand how this policy has been drafted, or what decisions are made, and how this is going to benefit them, and how their contribution has helped shape these decisions being made. But yeah, I agree. Understanding of the local nuances, what, like, these kind of contexts that to bring to the questions you go when we speak to people is really, really important.
Absolutely. And what do you feel is the when we are commissioned to support, what do you think are the biggest worries in clients' heads, I suppose, when they're starting, and how can we best allay them?
Yeah, so I think often people are really, really excited about this, but I think if I were to think about worries, one of the things is always, you know, can we deliver something that the public wants? And I think sometimes the public wants something, and it doesn't have to be something that you deliver immediately. You could always ask the public to prioritize what they want, you know, immediately, what they want in the medium term, and what they want in the short term. And we have techniques, obviously we can do that with the public, and that gives you almost like a roadmap to implement ultimately the ideal situation that people want. The other thing I think with concerns is often around the logistics, unfortunately. There's a lot of logistics involved, a lot of GDPR, and I think the ethics of public engagement often is a source of concern as well. I think, you know, public bodies can be accused of being extractive, and I think that's absolutely not something that they want to do, and we have mechanisms in place to make sure we do meaningful engagement. And I know meaningful engagement is up for debate of what is meaningful, but the least that we can do is, as I said, keep people in the loop, make sure people understand what's being asked of them, the purpose of whatever activities that happen in citizens' engagement, as well as, you know, tell them how their contribution have shaped the policy. So I think, kind of ethical and logistic concerns, as well as can we deliver, you know, what the public want are probably two things that I can think of being concerns of people who want to do that.
And there's teeth in these questions which are asked as well as you've demonstrated. There are if a question is about prioritization, it is about trade-offs, and actually the public,
the trade-offs,
in our experience, have been uniformly very good at being able to work out there is a trade-off. Whether it's in a health data research capacity, wondering, well, if my data is going to be used for research purposes, there will be a potential trade-off between the control that might be used from any data sets for which I've been part of the development of. But that's a trade-off that most people, most of the time, are more than willing to accept. But positioning the difficult questions is both an important part of the process, and also it's really it's wonderful to see that there's this is a country full of smart people who know that nothing comes for free.
Yeah, absolutely. On that trade-off point, one of the beauties of many of the public engagement methodologies is that you bring different and sometimes conflict views to the table, and therefore, if we're talking about a funding model of how this AI thing could be funded in the future, then we bring a view of, a person thinks that it should be funded this way, another person think it shouldn't be funded at all, or it should be funded out of pocket, or whatever that might be. And then you ask the public in the session to actually debate on those issues. That means you have actually considered things from both ends, and therefore you're coming to a more sensible conclusion rather than just go down one path.
Well, speaking of coming to a sensible conclusion,
sure.
Thank you for this fantastic opportunity to explore, where we are with AI, where we are with how the public can be brought as part, into the conversation. Any parting thoughts?
If I were to say one thought, I would say I think public engagement does pay off, and I think even if it's not something that you end up implementing, it's the views and just the expertise and knowledge that you gain from the public that will shape your thinking in the long term. Excellent. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you, Shuying. This has been the PSC In Conversation, part of the Next 20 series. Tune in for the next episode dropping shortly.
Thank you.